Hi, and welcome to the Great Women in Compliance podcast with Hema Lomax and me, Lisa Fine. We are sponsored by Corporate Compliance Insights and produced by Tom Fox and the Compliance Podcast Network. My guest today is Angie Gorman. She's a managing director at FTI Consulting. She's an expert in communications and change management and has taken that expertise into her work in ethics and compliance. And she particularly works on building and evolving cultures of compliance. She came into compliance with the experience in internal and external communications and not a lawyer, so she brings a very unique perspective to her work and our work. Recently, she was also one of the drivers of the FTI Ethico Compliance Leadership Defined Survey, second edition, which we'll also discuss. Angie, thank you for being here. And before we get to that, can you talk a bit about how you move from communications into compliance?
Hi, Lisa. Yeah, I am so excited to be here. It's always fun to talk to you and anybody in this community. So thank you for having me. And I am still in communications, by the way. I just spend most of my time now, and for about the last 5 years, focusing my work on compliance situations. So my work has consisted of internal communications, as you mentioned, change management, culture, and I've done that over many years for you name the kind of situation that a corporation or an organization faces. Over these last 5 years, I've been mostly focused on compliance clients who are either proactively trying to improve their program or who are reactively dealing with an investigation or the settlement after the conclusion of an investigation. And up until that time, about 5 years ago, become pretty bored, frankly, in my career. Feeling like I had learned everything that there was going to be for me to learn, having done pretty much everything many times over, and wondering if I needed to start figuring out my encore career. And then I got asked to help a client with a communications challenge. They were under investigation at the time, but this was a relatively small project. They had done some due diligence work to understand what was the root cause of the problem, and they wanted a communications campaign to help shift people's mindset about how they were thinking about their work and where the boundaries were. And so we did that. We helped them to craft the messaging and put together a theme and a campaign and some tactical recommendations for them for how they could get that message out. And it was really interesting. And then after that project, along came three or four more. One was a proactive effort to help introduce some new policies and procedures, but also to help the compliance team build its own sort of reputation and define its value proposition for the business and get their message out to their own organization. Also, really creative and interesting exercise. And a couple of my other projects were investigations, either post settlement or at the beginning of the investigation. And some of these, all of these really are still clients of mine and of FTI. And I just found the work to be so interesting. I've always been fascinated by leadership, whether we're talking about a president or a CEO, but I've always been so fascinated by the difference that one person can make in what a large group of people then do. And ethics and compliance has all of that, plus the law, but I just find it fascinating. And I discovered that I could bring what I do best to a group within an organization that I had never worked with before, and that frankly is not being well served by communications professionals, either in-house or via consulting firms, and make a huge difference for them. So this kind of fell in my lap and really just gave me a second wind right at the time that I needed it.
Yeah. Although you are not a lawyer, a lot of lawyers have fallen into it, not with and gotten a new lease on what we do and kind of an excitement that it is very similar. You mentioned a bit though about being a change management expert and talking about that. What do you see are the keys to building a culture of compliance?
There are lots of things I could talk about, but I'm gonna highlight three things in answer to that. The first one is it's important to recognize that your culture of compliance doesn't exist apart from the organization's larger culture. It's an element of the culture, and like any element of culture, you get what you cultivate. So it's really important to try to make sure that compliance gets the benefit of the same, what we call soft wiring and hard wiring that fosters all aspects of a company's culture. And I'll explain a little bit about what I mean by that. The first thing is to make sure that compliance is tightly connected to the organization's purpose and its values, and also, very importantly, to its business strategy. It has to be demonstrated by senior leaders who believe in it. Those are two of the soft wiring pieces. And then in the hard wiring part, there's an infrastructure that underlies culture that helps maintain it. And that includes performance management. So building compliance into performance expectations and performance management approaches, including metrics, including reward and recognition and compensation, especially variable compensation, is important. And it really should also be incorporated into professional development programs. When you are teaching and training a new manager or a new leader, what their role is in maintaining the company's compliance with laws, with regulations, and what is their role as a leader in demonstrating ethics and compliance. It doesn't always just come naturally to everybody. And every company has training of some kind, professional development of some kind as people move up in the organization. And compliance really should be integrated into that so that they're getting that kind of training too, and not just their technical training. Finally, there's a couple more things. Second, that was a big category of pay attention to your culture. The second one is you really need a constant drumbeat of communications and engagement that are positive and supportive in tone and relevant to people's jobs. That takes some work, and it is probably work that many compliance officers don't feel resourced for, but it's worth it to figure out. Whether you're getting some support from your in-house communications function or from somebody like me, it's an important piece of any culture. And then finally, what really helps to know where you're starting from in terms of where is your culture today in terms of the state of compliance within your larger culture. It takes a little bit of research to figure that out and set a benchmark and get the insights that you need so that you can really target the work you're going to do and use your resources efficiently. But it's actually not that hard to do. And it doesn't take that much money to do it. So it's really worth the effort. And I would say those are three keys to a really successful shift in culture.
And talking about that, is it easier? You've talked about pre-crisis, post-investigation. I wonder, we always, whether it's crisis or not, never waste a good crisis. But on the other hand, if you've got a successful situation, you haven't had a problem, and how do you build a culture or of compliance? Does it change, or how to get more buy-in if you maybe don't have that sudden, we need to do this tomorrow incentive?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And either way, culture change takes time and it takes sustained attention. Just because you have an investigation does not mean that things are going to change overnight in
Right.
terms of culture. And I think it's easier to get people's attention after a crisis or if you have a government investigation happening, but that doesn't necessarily make it easier to change the culture because in that scenario, you're often dealing with people who are feeling a lot of uncertainty, anxiety, defensiveness, even fear. And that's a lot to overcome. It doesn't necessarily make things easier. I do think it's easier and less expensive to invest in your compliance culture when you don't have that kind of pressure. And you can go at more palatable pace in a way that's more natural. Unfortunately, a lot of companies don't do that. Either the daily firefights or your budget constraints get in the way, or sometimes we talk to a lot of people who understand the importance of culture, and our survey kind of bears this out, understand the importance of culture, but they don't understand how to do something about it, how to act on it, because it's not in their job description. So I think sometimes that's a barrier too. But if you can do it proactively when you don't have the weight of the world on your shoulders, I think that's a better time to do it.
Yeah, you just suddenly get some of the buy-in. And one of the things I think of our jobs in a lot of ways as as a branding and communication exercise sometimes, like every small thing that may not be a problem, a crisis, but if you help people out when they needed something and they see the benefit incrementally, those are the people you can try to get support of generally saying we are proactive. So I think that's part of what I think all of us have to do a little bit of.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Relationships are everything. They're as important as your expertise and your ability. And true business partnership isn't about just being an expert. It's about being a trusted advisor.
Yeah.
And that requires a relationship. Relationships take time to build. And yes, if you've always, the old saying in public relations and communications is you got to make deposits into the trust bank.
Yeah.
Before the crisis comes,
That-
because otherwise you don't have anything to draw on when the
Yeah.
crisis hits. And that's what you're talking about, proactively being a help to the business, building those relationships, showing them that you can help them actually move forward better and faster and with less risk and all of that. It is definitely deposits in the trust bank.
Yeah. And they're become more and more important over time. And you talked a little bit about before, you talked about the different keys to the successful culture and a culture shift. But are there any other strategies we didn't talk about a few minutes ago that you'd want to raise on to build this culture? That we talked about some of those keys and any others.
Yeah, I think one other thing I would add, no doubt every compliance officer has a plan for how they're going to build their compliance program over time, whether they're just at the beginning or in a much more mature place. Make sure that plan includes how you're going to talk to the organization about it as well. And in addition to using your own channels like compliance newsletters and your SharePoint sites and all those things, try to get your messaging into broader employee communications channels as well. Things like town halls and digital signage in offices and plants, where you're going to get a lot more eyeballs and ears, because as human beings, awareness and understanding are the first things that we require before we can actually get on board and start doing something differently. And so if you're not reaching people, if people don't even know why you're here and how you benefit the business, it's going to be hard for you. So make part of your plan that communication, that outreach, that branding piece.
That's great. I also often think that people much prefer hearing the message from their actual managers and other people. And I will sometimes say to people, this is the easiest, cheapest, least expensive way for you to get that message across. If you as a leader says to your team, I hope you don't feel that you don't have the need to reach out because something is that bad. But even with me, you have these options. I feel like that matters a lot to people and it costs nothing. And I think it's so effective when it's not just us going out there banging that drum.
Yeah, absolutely. And senior leaders, obviously, but also middle managers, because the middle managers are the people who reach the most people every day, whether they're inside your organization or they're on the front line with customers. And that's who people listen to, the person right above them. And you guys don't have a ton of resources. And so this is an army of people you can enlist to help amplify your message and demonstrate the right behaviors and all of those things, starting with connect it to the values, make sure people understand all that, connect it to the business strategy, show them you're a partner, and you can build that advocacy over time.
So I'm going to switch topics to the report, the second edition of the Compliance Leadership Redefined. Can you tell us a little bit about the report?
Yeah, absolutely. We're pretty excited about Compliance Leadership Redefined. FTI does a lot of studies of leadership at different C-level positions. So CEOs and CFOs and CIOs. And I was proud to say 2 years ago, Chief Compliance Officers. So we first did the survey with Ethico in 2023 and repeated it again this year. And it's all about exploring leadership considerations for chief compliance officers and really looking at their role through that lens as opposed to the more operational lens. And we really just wanted to understand what are the challenges and trends that are shaping the compliance function. There's so much change always, and especially now, that people have to navigate. And what are they facing as they try to do that? That's really what we wanted to learn about. And so we hope it provides some insights as well as some actionable guidance on how a compliance officer can strengthen not only their program, but also their culture and the profession.
With that, what did you see in there either that surprised you 2 years ago and less now, or something new from then to now that was really notable to you?
Yeah, I think what surprised me the most from then to now, which maybe it shouldn't have, was that not much changed over the
Mhm.
last 2 years. And I know that there are other studies that show that not much has changed in a longer time period than that. Really, we think the story here is one of opportunity. There is an opportunity to try to do some things differently and see if that dynamic can't. But there were some surprises in the first study and then reinforced in the second one. And for me, some of the biggest ones were how little control compliance officers often have over the programs that they are tasked with designing and implementing. And especially given that scrutiny just continues to grow and expectations and consequences continue to grow, about half say that they don't have significant input into providing direction to the executive team or the board on compliance topics. About the same number don't even have an annual budget available to them to do the work that they need to do. That was pretty shocking.
Wow.
Um, Another point that really surprised me, I knew there was a disconnect between compliance and the business.
Mhm.
I see that in our client organizations all the time, but I was surprised by the intensity of the disconnect. About 2 years ago, the number was about 41%. I'm happy to say that's improved a tiny bit to about 32% of our respondents say that leadership puts pressure on them to downplay ethics and compliance risks when presenting to the board. That was kind of scary. And about a third of people agree that their organization supports and encourages compliance as long as it doesn't impede meeting revenue or operational targets.
Mhm.
That was pretty scary. And then another one that really was just a big shock. All of this has led to a lot of disillusionment on the part of a lot of compliance professionals. About half of all of the people that responded to the survey could be classified as detractors, saying that they would not recommend their organization's compliance program to other companies. So there's just such dissatisfaction there. That was surprising.
It's really interesting. And I also wonder if their dissatisfaction, if the company thinks that the program is great and they don't realize because they've kind of pushed different things on people that really even like the ground they're standing on is that shaky. It's interesting to think about that.
Yeah, and I don't have these numbers at my fingertips, but there were also pretty high numbers indicating that a lot of compliance officers don't believe that their leadership understands what the job of the compliance officer is. So they may think it's a good program, but they may not really know what makes a good program. So it certainly puts some challenges in front of
Yeah.
going to do this job.
That one I understand. It surprises me, but the only reason that one, and then I want to go back to talking about the business, but the reason that surprises me a little less is because I think sometimes even within the field, different organizations, different people, different, what does compliance mean? Can mean such different things to different people. That is also a challenge. We've had leaders who say, doesn't this mean that you every regulation everywhere for so you can call you if we have a question about one of them? No, I'm not real good with some of the books and accounting is not my compliance area day to day. Finance people are that. So I think that too is a really interesting thing because our field is so big. But
Yeah.
going back to the relationship between compliance and the business, you've talked about some of the thoughts and strategies to address this, but what do you think we can do better?
So I think it's really critical that compliance professionals try to reposition themselves as strategic enablers of the business and find new ways to articulate how the function really contributes to achieving the business strategy. You know, in everybody's job, mine included, there are so many days where you've got your head down, you've just got to get through what has to get done that day, that week. And oftentimes that means that we don't make time to build those relationships, to go out and help people understand what the function is all about and how it can help the business. That's really important. And if you have to literally schedule time for yourself to do that, it is worth it. So, being a business partner and kind of elevating yourself to make sure you're behaving like a peer to the other people who run the business,
Yeah.
I think is something that can be helpful. And then we talked a little bit about middle managers. I would say don't stop with just the senior leaders. Your middle managers are really important. There are a lot of ways to engage them. And your relationship with them is obviously going to be different than with the senior leaders of the business, but there are lots of ways to engage them, whether it's holding educational workshops that really help them understand what their role is and what's meaningful, to road shows, and don't wait to be invited. Invite yourself to meetings within the various functional areas, holding office hours, getting people involved in designing and testing solutions when you're designing a new policy or remediation. Nobody hates anything more than when someone says, Here, I've put this together for you and you must use it. And they didn't ask you a thing about how they do their work.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So bring them into the tent, make them help. That produces buy in.
Yeah. One of the other things in the report that I thought was really interesting was some of the things about effective measurements. And I know we've all heard the quote, what gets measured gets managed. Before we spoke, I looked it up to see. No one seems to know who it came from. Peter Drucker denied it. It was just one of those things that I looked up for one sentence to make sure I had it right. And it kind of really made me laugh a little. I'm like, you can't even figure out who said this. Having said that, I'm not sure I know if I agree with it, because our measured measurements, actually the effective ones. And you talk about some of the standard metrics in there, but what do you think that are good measurements?
Yeah, another really good question, because data is important and it's more important than it's ever been before. And when you're dealing with business leaders and the board, they think about the world in terms of revenue generation or cost optimization. And how are you going to help me with that? And they want to see the proof, the numbers. And this is a hard area to get the proof and the numbers on. So it's communications, the area I've spent my whole career in. It is hard to prove that what you did was directly related to the business outcome. But that doesn't mean it can't be done and you shouldn't try. So here's a way to think about it. Something that we've used for a long time in communications, and I think it can apply to compliance as well, is what we call the output impact outcome model. And that's basically a 3-column model. The first one being outputs, and those are basically things you can count. How many trainings did we do? How many trainings got completed? How many investigations did we resolve? How many reports did we get? And what was our survey participation? All those kinds of things that you can count. That's a place to start, but it doesn't really tell you about what resulted from it. So the next column is the impact column, and that's really about behaviors and attitudes that we can observe. So did the understanding of risk areas and policies and procedures increase or not? What about confidence in reporting compliance related issues, whether it's through the hotline or to managers? How is compliance being viewed? Is compliance culture viewed as a competitive advantage or not? That's an attitude, a mindset. Are compliance discussions happening as part of the business, as part of the performance management cycle? These are all things that are more behaviorally oriented, and typically it takes some more qualitative research to measure those things, but you get data out of it. And then the last column is outcome. And that question is really about, can we see any difference in the business metrics because of the action that we took? Did employee retention go up? Is employee engagement better? What about the caliber of the new talent coming in? Our reputation, of course, our customer loyalty, all of those things and more are business outcomes that you have some impact on. And you can work to make the connections between the work that you did and what it did for you. So I know that's easier said than done. And getting compliance hardwired into the infrastructure that supports your culture requires working with HR to adapt what are probably some well-established processes. But here's a way to think about that. If you want to think about actual performance metrics to see what people are doing, I think you really have to think about it based on a person's role in the company. You can't expect a frontline single individual contributor to be responsible for the same things that you expect a senior business leader to be responsible for. But that doesn't mean that they don't have things to be responsible for. As a function, Your responsibility is to design and implement and enforce a best practice compliance program. If you look at the individual, what can you hold them accountable for? You can hold them accountable for completing their trainings at the very minimum, for applying policies, for living the values every day, and for reporting issues. And some or all of those things can become performance metrics. And hopefully your values are already built into your performance management program. If you're a manager, you can be held accountable for all of that, plus communicating on a regular basis about compliance, recognizing the right behaviors, supporting people's goal achievement, meaning make time for them to take their training, yeah. And escalate issues as needed and when you're supposed to. And as a senior leader, all of that, plus setting the right expectations for people, making sure people feel like they can speak up freely, setting that cultural model, regularly reinforcing the connection to mission and vision and values, and addressing issues at the earliest possible point. And then the larger KPI for the company is, again, setting a benchmark score for your compliance culture, because now you've got something that you can measure over time and see if you're really making a difference. And you can also, within that, test some of the tactics you're using to see if those are really making a difference or not.
Those all are, it's a lot. That's like all the different things you want to actually be able to do. Going back to, I'm looking at it and thinking of it like your 3 box. And that's clearly a sign I've been in corporate work for long enough time when I've got the 3 box, the 6 box, the 9 box. But, and then change that. You've been in communications for internal, external, and now you're working compliance. And you've been through a lot to do that. You mentioned earlier how you almost were kind of ready to figure out what was next. But when you started out, when you're looking back at that now, can you tell us about something that you wish you knew when you started out?
Yeah, I guess we all have something we wish we knew. When I left college, and this is not on my LinkedIn profile because it's not relevant anymore, but I left college and I had a degree in graphic design and a degree in marketing, and my plan was to be a graphic designer. And that plan went by the wayside about 5 years in, and I made a decision to leave graphic design and move into the larger form of public relations and corporate communications. At the time I was working for Hill and Moulton, big PR firm. And after I made that move, I basically did whatever I was asked to do. I learned from every experience. I learned about what sparked my passion, and I just followed the opportunities. And I have been very lucky. I have had an amazing career, one I certainly never expected when I was in my 20s. And I am grateful for that every day. But looking back, I grew up in a small town and I went to a state college, and I took my first job in another small town a long way away from Chicago, where I have lived and worked for almost 40 years. I wish I had realized that I could have had a much broader horizon, that I wish I had the confidence to feel like I deserved to be in the room, in the upper echelon of my profession. And I got there eventually, but building up that confidence took a long time. And I wish I had realized that I didn't need to be intimidated, and I just needed to just be confident. And even if I maybe didn't feel it, show it, because I wasn't really lacking anything except maybe some experience.
I think a lot of us, especially women and women in my generation, we did feel that way, whether deliberately or not. Were we supposed to be there? And not realizing that we were equally as qualified as particularly men who just didn't care. It didn't even come into their mind that they shouldn't be there. I think it's a little, and I think younger women are hopefully they're getting much better about that or hearing more about it. But I definitely wish I realized now the same kind of thing, that, I was as smart as the rest of them, and not to let that sometimes become this like paralyzing fear.
Yeah, absolutely. And I learned over time that, and they didn't know any more than they knew. Sometimes people who I knew very well watching at the front of the room, and I'm like, I know he does not know what he's talking about right now, but he sure sounds good, and everybody's buying it. That was kind of an important lesson at one point. And
Awful when you learn that one, but it's great. But it's also you're looking at it thinking, oh my goodness, I've spent hours preparing for this, and this guy is just out there winging it, and people are nodding away.
yeah, Yeah. And like kind of in the same vein, I have a mentor who was my boss a long time ago and very senior to me. And I was in a meeting with him one time, a client meeting, and client asked him a question. And he said, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question, but here's what we need to think about. And I thought, oh, wow, I thought we had to have all the answers. He said he didn't know and he didn't get thrown out of the room. That was a revelation to me as well at that point. So yeah, the whole confidence thing, it's don't handicap yourself like that.
I'm glad you spent all these years doing amazing work and inspiring lots of women for it, including me. I'm so thrilled that you guys spent some time with me today. Thank you so much for being here on behalf of the Compliance Podcast Network. Thanks for joining Great Women in Compliance.
No, thank you so much.